Okay, now we're going to go ahead and edit our images in Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to edit all of these images. They have similar lighting situations. They were shot about the same time of day within a given hour, hour and a half, give or take. And so with all the current settings of the camera, white balance and whatnot, they were all very similar. So we can go ahead and edit these at the same time and apply similar adjustments. Then we can tweak individual images from that point on. So again, I'm going to go under the Edit menu and select All. Now if it's a Camera Raw file, you can actually just double click any of these file thumbnails and it will actually jump up into Camera Raw or Adobe Camera Raw. Or I can go under the File menu and say File, Open in Camera Raw. So let's go ahead and do that. What it will do is it may launch Photoshop in the background. In this case, it did not, which is fantastic. And so we want to go ahead and take a look at our workspace here. And I'm going to go ahead and make the screen a little bit bigger so you can actually see things. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller here. And I'm going to say, nope, it's opening in Bridge. Perfect. You may see Bridge on the far right-hand side. Okay, so notice on the left-hand column here, we have thumbnails from all our images. All you have to do, and we'll show you how to do this, is edit one, and we can apply those settings to each image here. First off, I want to go ahead and give you just kind of a rough idea of what you're looking at, what the interface looks like, and some of the tools that we're going to be using. Initially, at least for this video, we're going to edit our images globally, which means we're going to address the exposure, the white balance, highlights, shadows, and whatnot for the entire image, not selectively. We'll learn how to go in and selectively modify our images so we can remove things like this little orange flag here and maybe burn or dodge, which means darken or lighten our image depending on what you're trying to achieve. We'll do that in another video. For this, we're just going to make global adjustments to our entire image. A couple things we need to set first or double check first and set our workspace up so that next time you come in you don't have to worry about this. If this is your first time in Bridge, or I'm sorry, in Adobe Camera Raw, you want to confirm the workflow options down at the bottom here. So it looks like a little link on a web page. I'm just going to click that, and these are our workflow options. So we have our color space here, we have our image sizing, output sharpening, and this Photoshop option. If you're shooting Camera Raw, it's recommended that you use ProPhoto RGB for color space and use 16 bits per channel. The reason is that a ProPhoto RGB color space is a larger color space than, let's say, Adobe RGB or especially sRGB. Color spaces are just the available colors for a particular device. The depth means 16 bits per channel or 8 bits per channel. So think of it this way for the depth. 8 bits per channel, let's say you had a grayscale image and it was only 8 bits per channel. Well, that 8 bits translates into 256 shades of gray. Okay, not to get too technical, but it's 2 to the 8th power, and which equals 256. Now, for our raw files, we have 16 bits per channel as an option, a much larger color space or larger amount of information. 2 to the 16th power, or 16 bits, is about 65,000 shades of gray. So having more information gives us a lot more wiggle room to make adjustments to the highlights, to the shadows, midtones, and so on. You can still make those changes in 8 bits, but you may remove or not have information at your disposal to make the changes that are necessary. So we're going to leave it at 8 bits, leave it at 16 bits per channel at ProPhoto, and that's our color space that we're going to be working in here. For image sizing, I'm going to leave that off. You don't really need to resize it unless you know specifically you need to resize it for a particular width and height, dimensions, and so on. We can always do this down the line. Okay, so keeping the raw file intact or keeping it as the original dimensions, perfect. We'll just leave it at this and we won't resize it at all. Output sharpening, we'll talk more about sharpening, but we're going to leave it alone, leave it off. And at some point, I want to introduce you to Open in Photoshop as a smart object. The whole process with shooting Camera Raw and editing Camera Raw is it's a non-destructive process, which means you're not really deleting or removing information, you're just changing the way it looks. You can always go back and fix it or change it, you know, in a non-destructive way. If I had a JPEG, say, and I shifted the color and saved it, I can't go back. You know, it's done. It's a done deal. So we want to make sure that we work as non-destructively as possible so that way we can go back and make fine-tuning adjustments or tweaks in the future. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be sloppy right away and then you have to go back and fix it. It just gives you the latitude of going back and fixing something that maybe you didn't quite catch the first time. Okay, so now that we've set our color space and left basically the rest of this unchecked, the little check boxes, we're going to click OK. That's all set. As soon as you exit Adobe Camera Raw, then you should, these settings will be applicable, so you don't have to worry about it. Okay, so what else do we need to do here? I'm going to look at the right-hand column, right-hand panel here, and point out a couple things. We have white balance and our color temperature and tint, exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, clarity, vibrance, and saturation. These are our basic editing options, and we'll address those here in just 1 minute. The other item that I want to point out, and this is will be part of your workflow. We set the workflow options, that's step 1. Then I want to go over here to lens correction. Now, all our lenses have an inherent, you know, potentially distortion factor as well as chromatic aberration, which means the shifting of colors once it's captured. And so I'm going to go ahead and click that. And so notice, I unclicked it again. Notice the image change on screen. Notice the edges got a little bit brighter and it kind of popped out a little bit. So I'm going to undo it again and I'm going to redo it again. Okay, it knows based on the information that came with the digital file which camera it was, which lens it was, and you know which profile was set. Now you can go in and make your own custom profiles. We're not going to do that in this class, but if you need to, you can. If you notice that there's still more distortion or vignetting, you can actually adjust these sliders here. It's super subtle, but it's kind of bulging out or pushing in. So I'm going to leave it here at 100 where it was. And then vignetting is just the darkening or lightening of the edges. Notice the edges got darker here and they get lighter here. I can always type in a number as well. Okay, so chromatic aberration just in case, and enable profile corrections. Great. Let's go back to the basic tab. We'll talk about the other options here down the line, but for right now, let's just concentrate on the basic adjustments. So first off, we want to correct our white balance if it needs correction. So usually by default, white balance is set as shot. So one of the things you want to get in the habit of doing is setting the white balance when you're shooting the image in your camera. So if it's daylight, set it to daylight. If it's tungsten or your hot household light bulbs, not fluorescent, but your regular household light bulbs that get hot, that's tungsten. If you're out on a cloudy day or you're in open shade, meaning it's a sunny day, but you're actually not in the sun, you're in the shade, set it to the shade, and so on. And so get in the habit of doing that. Now, the nice thing is with Camera Raw, we can actually change that if it seems appropriate to do so down the line, but get in a good habit of actually doing that initially. So I can set auto so it can see what it thinks is the best option. Let's say I set the shade. Now it's a bright sunny day and it's not shady. Typically when you're shooting in the shade, you'll have a blue cast to the image, as well as if it's a cloudy day. So it's going to add the opposite, which is yellow. And so if it's daylight, that's going to be more neutral. If you shot under tungsten and you set it to daylight, you're going to get something completely different. Now, if you shot under tungsten, and you may have seen this, and it was set to daylight, your image would probably come out orange or orange-yellow. Then it's going to add blue when you set it to tungsten and compensate for that. Fluorescent, and so on. So you can go through these and check them out. If you know you dialed it in correctly and it looks good, great. Just leave it as shot. If you happen to shoot one of the color checkers or a gray card in the first shot, at the top here, notice there's a white balance tool. And so whatever I click on, and in your situation, if you shot the gray card, you would actually click on the gray card or the gray swatch on your color checker, and it would correct for that. Now, if you click on something that's not neutral, such as the gray card or the color checker, it will compensate and give you what it thinks is the correct correction. Again, when you're using the white balance eyedropper, it's looking for a neutral source. So I'm going to click here and see what it does. So it must have been a little bit blue because it gave me a little bit more of a yellow tint to it. Now if I click on the green grass here, which we know is not neutral, it's going to make it more purpley or magenta. Click on the red. Wow. Okay, so we don't want to do that. So when you do make changes with the white balance eyedropper, it sets your white balance to custom. Now I can always go back and say auto or as shot, and so I think as shot is probably the closest one for now. For you, it may be different. If you need to adjust the color temperature, and the blue and yellow scale, let me just slide it to the extreme here. So I give it more of yellow because that's the mood you wanted. And we'll talk more about color as we go along. Or a tint here. You can play with that as well. But I think as you're starting out, let's keep it simple and use as shot, auto, or if you specify daylight and you want to go here and manually change it to daylight, you should do that. Okay, so now we have our white balance set. Some of the other things we're going to deal with: exposure, contrast. We're going to look at the highlights and shadows, whites and the blacks. And then we'll go in and we'll do a little bit of embellishing with these items here. Okay, so for now, let's go ahead and I'm going to, let's see. Yeah, this image will work. Let's go in and change the exposure. Now the exposure looks pretty good on this, if I don't like to brag, but it looks pretty good. Now you could click on auto and, okay, here's a bad joke. It's not because there's a car in the scene that this is called auto, it's just automatic corrections. And the idea here is that it gets you a starting point. The software is pretty darn smart and it can tell you what it thinks those corrections need to be. So if I click on auto, it made a slight adjustment. You can use that as your starting point. You don't have to guess and slide things over and over again just to kind of end up in the same spot as auto did. And so click on auto, see if you like it. If you don't, just go back to default and then make your own adjustments. Or click on auto. It lightened up these areas here. You can see it increased the exposure and contrast and so on. And so it made certain adjustments that may or may not be what I would have done. But it gives you a good starting point.